Have you ever wondered why some relationships, despite their promise, leave you feeling drained and confused? You might have been in the presence of a man who seemed charming, attentive, even generous. Yet over time, the warmth you felt transformed into an unsteady tension. It is here, in the silent shifts of attention, in the subtle withdrawal of care, that narcissistic control hides its artful deception. He does not merely seek affection. He seeks the power to define your reality, to bend your perceptions so that your truth becomes malleable, uncertain, a shadow of itself. The sovereign queen recognizes this dance immediately, not because she overanalyzes, but because she feels the misalignment in her own energy, the quiet dissonance between what is said and what is lived. Narcissistic control operates through what the modern psychologist calls emotional manipulation, but in archetypal terms, it is the projection of his unresolved ego mirrored back onto your world. Every criticism, every subtle rebuke is a reflection of his inner chaos. He projects insecurities, fears, and needs onto you, seeking not connection but control. And you, if unaware, may find yourself adjusting, softening, justifying your choices, your emotions, your very presence, in ways that diminish the core of your being. Shadow dynamics thrive in this silence. The unseen cords of manipulation entwine, often unnoticed, until exhaustion is the only proof that something is wrong. Yet boundary work is not simply the act of saying no. It is the embodiment of emotional clarity, the conscious placement of limits that honor your inner truth. To the sovereign queen, boundaries are sacred. They are not reactive, they are declarative. They are the internal compass that refuses distortion. When you consistently and calmly maintain these lines, the narcissistic control begins to falter. Its power is not destroyed in confrontation or argument. It crumbles quietly in the face of clarity. Like a wave meeting an immovable cliff, the attempts to reshape your reality fail against the solidity of your awareness. Consider the emotional trap, a moment when you question yourself, when guilt sneaks in under the guise of love, when empathy becomes a lever to pull you back into submission. The trauma bond whispers that love requires compromise of self, that loyalty is measured by sacrifice, that forgiveness must be endless. But emotional intelligence teaches another language. It whispers that self-respect is not negotiable, that clarity is the truest form of intimacy, and that liberation begins with discerning the difference between influence and manipulation. Every time you notice this subtle pull and choose to honor your boundary, the unseen threads of control weaken. Ego projection can be subtle yet persistent. He may tell stories that paint you as fragile, overly sensitive, or unreasonable, when in fact he is projecting his fear of accountability and his need for dominance. The sovereign queen recognizes these distortions without anger, without a fight to prove herself right. She observes, she reflects, she holds her inner truth as the axis around which her choices revolve. Stoic philosophy aligns here. Your calm is the anchor. The world may rage with manipulative tactics, yet your composure and clarity remain untouched. The more consistent you are, the more the narcissistic attempts to destabilize lose their energy. Trauma-informed psychology reveals that repeated cycles of manipulation, gaslighting, and intermittent validation form a bond that can feel addictive. The empath within may feel compelled to rescue, to soften, to explain, to endure. Yet understanding the archetype within, the sovereign queen shifts the lens. She knows that endurance is not strength. Clarity is strength. Power does not reside in endurance of distortion, but in consistent reclamation of self. Every moment you choose self-reclamation over appeasement, the pattern of narcissistic control begins to unravel. Its hold was never on love. It was on uncertainty. Remove the uncertainty, and the control collapses. It is important to recognize the subtle victories. a refusal to answer when provoked, a quiet decision to leave a manipulative conversation, an inner affirmation that your feelings are valid and your limits inviolable. These are not dramatic gestures, but they are seismic in their effect. Narcissistic control cannot survive where there is emotional clarity, consistent boundary work, and self-respect. Your internal state radiates outward. The unseen loops of manipulation are revealed and disrupted not by confrontation, but by unwavering alignment with your truth. The sovereign queen does not negotiate her value, she radiates it. And in that radiation, the shadows of manipulation lose their substance. As you cultivate awareness, you begin to notice the patterns, the subtle testing, the withdrawal of attention, the praise that comes with conditions. Each is a thread in a tapestry of control, and yet, as the sovereign queen, you learn to observe without attachment, to honor without compromise. You are no longer pulled into the narrative constructed by another. You are constructing your own narrative, guided by emotional intelligence, anchored in clarity, and unshaken by ego projections cast your way. In this space, narcissistic control begins to erode, not with confrontation, not with rage, but through the quiet force of your presence and consistency. Ask yourself now, if you maintained this clarity and boundary work, how would your relationships shift? What would remain and what would fall away? The answer is subtle yet undeniable. Control cannot coexist with clarity. Manipulation cannot thrive in the presence of unwavering self-reclamation. And in that knowledge, the sovereign queen finds her power, not in defeating others, but in standing fully in her truth. The first step in dismantling narcissistic control is recognizing the patterns that quietly repeat themselves, day after day. Often, these patterns are cloaked in charm, affection, or even concern. A subtle withdrawal of attention after minor transgressions, or the appearance of criticism disguised as guidance, forms a rhythm that teaches compliance. It conditions the empath or sensitive partner to self-doubt, to constant evaluation of their own behavior, to the anxious question, "Am I enough?" But the sovereign queen notices these rhythms without needing to decode every gesture. She feels the dissonance and trusts her internal compass. Emotional intelligence allows her to distinguish between influence born of mutual respect and manipulation born of ego insecurity. Shadow dynamics are at the heart of this manipulation. Every human carries unintegrated parts of themselves, the rejected, the denied, the feared. When a narcissistic partner projects these shadows onto you, it is not about your flaws. It is about their unresolved interior landscape seeking form. Criticism, blame, and control are the masks worn by their unacknowledged self. Recognizing this allows you to depersonalize the attacks. You begin to see that the emotional turbulence they generate is an echo of their inner chaos, not a verdict on your value. The sovereign queen does not internalize these projections. She observes, discerns, and maintains her boundary with calm authority. Boundary work is not reactive, it is preemptive. The sovereign queen understands that clear limits do not provoke narcissistic control, they illuminate it. When you declare what is acceptable in your life, even silently through consistent action, you are not negotiating with another's ego. You are speaking to the truth of your own existence. Every firm no, every refusal to rationalize your emotions, every choice to walk away from unnecessary conflict signals a non-negotiable standard. Narcissistic control, dependent on confusion and self-doubt, begins to crumble before it even encounters resistance. Your clarity becomes the antidote to the persistent attempts at domination. The trauma bond, so often cited in modern psychology, is a powerful force precisely because it plays on intermittent reinforcement. Moments of affection, praise, or attention are strategically spaced with withdrawal or coldness. This keeps the empath invested, hoping, and often trapped. Yet emotional intelligence and archetypal awareness illuminate these cycles. You begin to recognize not the rare gestures of kindness, but the overall architecture of control. The sovereign queen is attentive not to the peaks of interaction, but to the landscape of patterns. She asks, does this relationship nourish my truth, or does it distort it? In this question lies the seed of freedom. Ego projection often manifests as gaslighting, subtle accusations, or a reframing of events to position you as unstable or overly emotional. These are attempts to rewrite reality so that you rely on their perception rather than your own. Recognizing these tactics requires vigilance and emotional literacy. It requires that you develop a strong relationship with your inner narrative, your inner truth. The sovereign queen refuses to outsource her reality. She checks in with her own feelings, trusts her intuition, and names the distortions as they arise. In doing so, she dismantles the foundations upon which narcissistic control thrives. Self-reclamation is the ongoing practice that underpins all progress. It is not a single moment of defiance, but a consistent habit of honoring yourself, your energy, and your boundaries. Every act of self-respect, no matter how small, is a brick in the wall of emotional sovereignty. Saying no to manipulative requests, stepping back from energy-draining interactions, asserting needs without apology. All of these build the internal fortress that narcissistic control cannot breach. The sovereign queen cultivates this fortress with quiet determination, understanding that true power is expressed in integrity, not aggressio. And attachment wounds often amplify susceptibility to control. Past experiences of invalidation, neglect, or inconsistent caregiving create neural pathways that anticipate abandonment or require external validation. Narcissistic partners unconsciously exploit these wounds. Yet awareness is transformative. Recognizing your own patterns of attachment allows you to pause before automatic responses, before guilt, before justification, before appeasement. The sovereign queen does not erase the wounds. She names them, integrates them, and chooses her response consciously. She learns to meet her own needs first, making manipulation attempts ineffective. The subtle victories accumulate over time. A refusal to engage in arguments, a calm acknowledgement of manipulation, an unwavering adherence to personal limits. All of these actions teach another lesson. Control is not found in obedience. Emotional clarity radiates outward, signaling that the power resides not in domination, but in self-possession. Narcissistic control, dependent on uncertainty and submission, begins to disintegrate quietly. You do not need to confront, to shout, or to justify. The mere act of holding space for your truth is enough to destabilize a dynamic built on shadows and projections. Ask yourself, if every choice you made honored your emotional clarity and boundaries, how would the relationship landscape shift? Which patterns would persist and which would dissolve under the weight of unwavering self-respect? Reflection is the ally of the sovereign queen. She does not seek to control others, only to master herself. And in this mastery, the structures of manipulation crumble. The subtle threads that once held you in the cycle of uncertainty now hang loose, ready to fall away. In your presence, clarity becomes both shield and sword, and narcissistic control becomes a relic of the past. Gaslighting often emerges in ways so subtle that the victim questions not only what happened, but their own judgment. Words are twisted, events reframed, feelings minimized. You're overreacting, or that never happened the way you think, are common refrains, designed to destabilize trust in yourself. The sovereign queen, however, senses the dissonance before it escalates. She pauses, observes, and separates the truth of her perception from the narrative offered to her. Emotional clarity is her anchor. It allows her to stand firm even when the currents of manipulation attempt to pull her under. Understanding the psychological roots of gaslighting requires examining projection. Often, those who manipulate reality are displacing their own unresolved fears, insecurities, or moral conflicts. They attempt to implant confusion to avoid accountability. The cycle is reinforced by intermittent reinforcement, moments of charm or apology intermixed with coldness or criticism. This irregular pattern keeps the empath hoping, questioning, and ultimately invested. The sovereign queen recognizes the rhythm not as affection, but as a strategic design to control, and she refuses to dance along. Boundary work is the critical tool that interrupts this cycle. Every clearly stated limit, every refusal to justify feelings or behaviors, serves as a signal that manipulation will no longer succeed. Boundaries are not walls built from anger. They are declarations of inner truth. When maintained consistently, they disrupt the carefully constructed architecture of control. The sovereign queen practices this daily, integrating it into her life with both firmness and grace. She understands that the strength of a boundary is amplified not by confrontation, but by consistency and clarity. Trauma bonds reinforce susceptibility to gaslighting and narcissistic control. A trauma bond forms through repeated cycles of reward and withdrawal, love and criticism. It creates a neurological pattern that links emotional highs and lows to attachment, making it difficult to disengage. Awareness is transformative. Recognizing these cycles, naming them, and understanding the underlying mechanisms allows the sovereign queen to reclaim her autonomy. The bond loses its hold when it no longer commands fear or hope, only measured observation and self-possession. Ego projection continues to be a potent force. The narcissistic partner often projects their shadows onto you, attributing faults or intentions that originate within themselves. This is not a reflection of your reality, but a mirror of their unresolved psyche. Understanding this distinction is liberating. The sovereign queen does not absorb these projections. She discerns, filters, and lets them pass without altering her own perception. She practices detachment without disconnection, empathy without self-erasure. Self-reclamation is an ongoing journey of reinforcing identity and value. It is cultivated through daily choices, asserting needs, protecting energy, prioritizing well-being. Each act of reclamation chips away at the foundation of manipulation. Emotiona. Intelligence and boundary work are not one-time acts. They are habits that strengthen over time. The sovereign queen understands that reclaiming self is not about punishing another, but about establishing equilibrium within. Her consistency is what destabilizes control, more than confrontation ever could. Attachment wounds may amplify reactivity to manipulative tactics. Early experiences of neglect or conditional love create vulnerabilities that a skilled manipulator can exploit. The sovereign queen, however, uses awareness as armor. She identifies her triggers, observes them without judgment, and chooses responses aligned with her truth. This conscious engagement interrupts automatic cycles of compliance, guilt, or appeasement. Over time, these practices rewrite the neural pathways that once facilitated vulnerability, replacing them with resilience and discernment. The subtle power of emotional clarity is revealed in silence and presence. You do not need to argue, explain, or defend. The mere act of standing in your own truth communicates strength. Narcissistic control depends on uncertainty, confusion, and emotional reactivity. When met with calm consistency, the cycle falters. Each moment of self-possession erodes the mechanisms of manipulation, revealing that control was never in their hands. It was never outside of you. The sovereign queen embodies this truth, her presence a force that reshapes dynamics without confrontation. Consider, if every interaction were approached with unwavering emotional clarity, how would the web of manipulation unravel? Which behaviors would persist and which would dissipate in the face of self-respect? Reflection is not passive. It is the active tool of mastery. The sovereign queen leverages her insight to observe, to anticipate, and to act from alignment rather than reaction. In this deliberate engagement, the architecture of narcissistic control begins to crumble, leaving space for authentic connection, or, if necessary, dignified separation. Empathy, when untempered by discernment, can become a gateway for manipulation. The empathic heart feels deeply, senses unspoken intentions, and instinctively seeks harmony. In the presence of a narcissistic partner, this gift is weaponized against itself. Compliments, apologies, or displays of vulnerability are strategically placed to elicit guilt, compliance, or self-doubt. The sovereign queen, however, cultivates selective empathy. She senses emotion without absorbing it, observes motives without internalizing them, and responds in alignment with her inner truth rather than the projected narrative of another. Shadow dynamics are integral to understanding relational turbulence. Each person carries unacknowledged aspects of the psyche, traits, desires, or fears they deny or repress. Narcissistic partners often project their shadow, attributing destructive motives or flaws to those around them. This projection can trigger defensiveness, confusion, or even shame in the recipient. Recognizing projection allows the sovereign queen to disentangle her identity from these illusions. She maintains a reflective stance, discerning what belongs to her, what belongs to the other, and what exists in the interplay. Clarity emerges not through reaction, but through conscious observation. Energy protection becomes a daily practice. Emotional predators thrive on drained, reactive targets. Boundaries alone are insufficient if emotional presence remains scattered. The sovereign queen cultivates rituals to restore and shield her energy. Moments of stillness, reflection, journaling, and selective engagement. These practices are not indulgences, they are strategic reinforcements. With energy intact, emotional intelligence becomes actionable. Decisions are made from alignment rather than urgency, and the manipulative cycle loses its leverage. Presence, calm, and deliberate action form a triad of defense that cannot be coerced. Understanding relational trauma is equally crucial. Patterns from past attachments can unconsciously invite repetition of familiar dynamics. Narcissistic partners often mirror these unresolved patterns, creating resonance that feels compelling yet destructive. The sovereign queen observes the echo without surrendering to it. She traces the origin of triggers, acknowledges lingering vulnerabilities, and chooses responses that honor her current self rather than the child she once was. This conscious engagement interrupts generational cycles, turning pain into mastery and insight into power. Discernment is reinforced by emotional literacy. Recognizing the difference between genuine remorse and performative apology, between loving action and manipulative kindness, sharpens judgment. The sovereign queen learns to read intentions without relying on verbal assurance. Tone, timing, consistency, and alignment with past behavior provide the data for evaluation. Each observation informs boundary enforcement, creating a feedback loop that strengthens then's autonomy and diminishes susceptibility to emotional entanglement. The interplay of ego projection and shadow recognition illuminates why narcissistic control persists. When the manipulator projects unresolved conflict onto another, it is an attempt to externalize inner chaos. The recipient who lacks awareness may internalize these projections, reacting defensively or feeling guilt and confusion. The sovereign queen recognizes projections as mirrors, not indictments. By reflecting without absorbing, she preserves her autonomy and diminishes the power of control. In this practice, Insight itself becomes a tool of liberation. Attachment wounds often complicate the disentanglement process. A partner's unpredictability can trigger deeply ingrained fears of abandonment or rejection. The sovereign queen acknowledges these vulnerabilities without capitulating to them. Awareness paired with boundary enforcement transforms fear into informed caution. She cultivates patience with herself, observing emotional impulses without automatic compliance. This conscious regulation interrupts the cycle of control, allowing space for thoughtful decision-making rather than reactive engagement. Ultimately, mastery of self becomes a quiet but potent force. The combination of emotional clarity, discernment, energy protection, and reflective engagement dismantles manipulative frameworks from within. Narcissistic behaviors may persist in form, but their impact diminishes as the sovereign queen operates from alignment with inner truth. The silent authority of consistency, insight, and self-possession challenges the illusion of control. The more firmly she inhabits her boundaries and honors her autonomy, the faster the architecture of manipulation begins to collapse. Ask yourself, how might your interactions change if every moment were approached with unwavering discernment and energy protection? Which patterns would survive, and which would dissolve in the presence of conscious clarity? Reflection is the precursor to liberation. The sovereign queen does not wait for change outside. She enacts it within, and in doing so, shifts the very dynamics that once sought to contain her. The trauma bond is often invisible until we observe the repetition of patterns. Moments of tension followed by charm, emotional withdrawal followed by overt attention, manipulation followed by apology. This cycle creates a neurochemical rhythm that subtly reinforces attachment even as it harms. The sovereign queen, however, recognizes the rhythm without succumbing to it. She sees the lure of familiarity and the seduction of intermittent reward, understanding that the compulsion she feels is manufactured, not natural. Awareness alone begins to erode the cycle, for when the pattern is named, it loses the power to dominate unconsciously. Self-reclamation begins with reclaiming the narrative. In many manipulative dynamics, the story of the relationship is authored by the person who seeks control. Words are twisted, memories reframed, and intentions distorted. The sovereign queen restores authorship to herself. She records, reflects, and articulates her experience from her perspective, ensuring that reality is not surrendered to projection. This practice is not about retaliation. It is about presence and truth. Each act of self-definition strengthens her autonomy, creating an internal structure impervious to manipulation. Ego projection often fuels confusion in these relationships. The manipulator projects unmet desires, insecurities, and shadow traits onto their partner, creating scenarios that provoke guilt, doubt, or overcompensation. Recognizing projection allows the sovereign queen to disengage from reactive impulses. She examines the behaviors, separates her reality from the projected narrative, and responds with measured clarity. In doing so, she transforms moments of manipulation into opportunities for insight. The clarity gained is both protective and liberating, establishing boundaries that are not reactive but preemptive. Energy management intersects with boundary work in subtle but essential ways. Every emotional exchange carries a charge: attention, irritation, hope, or longing. The sovereign queen tracks this energy consciously, choosing where it flows and where it is withheld. Silence, selective engagement, and emotional neutrality are not withdrawal, they are strategic positioning. By conserving energy, she prevents the manipulation loop from gaining momentum. Each intentional pause reinforces the internal architecture of self-reclamation, making intrusion or coercion increasingly ineffective. Shadow dynamics within the manipulator often manifest as seductive or punishing behaviors. The unpredictability creates a psychological landscape that tempts overinvestment. The sovereign queen observes these behaviors as expressions of another's inner chaos rather than reflections of her own inadequacy. By maintaining awareness, she interrupts the unconscious mimicry that would otherwise perpetuate the trauma bond. She responds not with emotion alone, but with aligned thought and discernment, demonstrating that mastery over self is stronger than any imposed narrative. The empath-narcissist cycle is further complicated by deep-seated vulnerabilities. Familiarity and psychological resonance can create temporary illusions of intimacy, drawing the empath back despite conscious knowledge of harm. The sovereign queen approaches these moments with deliberate reflection. She asks, "What is the origin of this pull? Which past wound does it echo?" By tracing these impulses without judgment, she transforms them from unconscious hooks into conscious choice. In this space, autonomy flourishes, and the cycle begins to lose its grip. Discernment sharpens with pattern recognition. The sovereign queen catalogs not to dwell but to predict and protect. She observes inconsistencies between words and actions, the timing of affection, the subtle shifts in tone, and the selective transparency offered. Each observation informs calibrated responses, ensuring that engagement is conscious rather than compulsive. Over time, the manipulative rhythm falters, for it relies on ignorance, confusion, and emotional absorption. Awareness dismantles these pillars one insight at a time. Ultimately, self-reclamation is both shield and sword. It protects emotional territory and reasserts autonomy while dismantling the architecture of manipulation. The more the sovereign queen embodies clarity, the less the trauma bond retains influence. Freedom is cultivated in the quiet alignment of thought, feeling, and action. She does not chase, coerce, or appease. She simply occupies her space with presence, authority, and unshakable truth. In this sovereignty, the cycle that once dominated her existence begins to crumble, leaving clarity and empowerment as her inheritance. Ask yourself, how would your choices change if every pull, every charm, every withdrawal were seen as a test of your own clarity rather than a reflection of your worth? Which cycles would you allow to persist, and which would you dissolve with conscious observation? The sovereign queen does not wait for others to change. She transforms the dynamics from within, and in that transformation, liberation becomes inevitable. Boundary work is not merely an action. It is a state of being. The sovereign queen does not announce her boundaries to control others. She embodies them so fully that they are visible in her presence and behavior. Every refusal, every pause, every maintained standard communicates her self-respect without argument or justification. In manipulative dynamics, boundaries function as a form of immunity. They prevent the emotional toxins of guilt, obligation, and projection from penetrating her internal landscape. This consistency erodes the manipulator's leverage, for influence depends on blurred lines and uncertain responses. Clarity in emotional exchange reinforces these boundaries. The manipulator thrives on ambiguity, exploiting the gray areas between empathy and compliance. The sovereign queen names her feelings without hesitation, identifies her expectations, and distinguishes between her responsibility and the other's behavior. This clarity is disarming. It interrupts the unconscious scripts of control and diminishes the opportunity for gaslighting. Emotional transparency, when coupled with firm boundaries, transforms the relational terrain from one of reaction to one of choice, dismantling the invisible structures that supported manipulation. Energy sovereignty is an extension of boundary work. Emotional energy is finite, and the manipulator often seeks to drain, redirect, or distort it for self-serving purposes. The sovereign queen monitors her energetic state, ensuring that she engages selectively. She does not invest in guilt-inducing narratives or attempts to appease projected insecurities. Silence, selective conversation, and emotional neutrality are tools to preserve her vitality. By maintaining energetic sovereignty, she ensures that her presence is grounded, resilient, and capable of withstanding attempts at coercion without depletion. Discernment deepens with repeated observation. The sovereign queen watches patterns not to judge, but to predict and protect. She identifies triggers intentionally, noting the subtle signs that precede manipulative behaviors, tone, pacing, micro-expressions, or shifts in attention. Each observation becomes a defensive tool. By responding from awareness rather than impulse, she gradually reduces the manipulator's capacity to provoke reaction. Over time, repeated recognition and measured response collapse the cycle that once thrived on unpredictability, replacing it with predictable sovereignty. Self-reclamation also requires internal dialogue and reflection. The sovereign queen examines her own attachment wounds and unconscious tendencies with honesty. She asks, "Where do I seek validation?" From external sources. Which habits allow manipulation to persist? Which fears need acknowledgement but not action? By addressing these questions, she strengthens her internal framework. The manipulator's influence is minimized not through confrontation alone, but through cultivated self-possession. Mastery of self becomes the primary instrument in dissolving external control. Stoic principles support this practice. The world of relationships is inherently unpredictable, yet internal calm need not depend on external behavior. The sovereign queen distinguishes between what she can control, her perception, her response, her boundaries, and what she cannot, the other's choices, projections, or manipulations. This separation of influence from control is a form of resilience. It allows her to remain composed amidst chaos, reducing the emotional fuel that manipulators rely upon to maintain dominance. Integration of shadow dynamics completes the cycle. Recognizing the manipulator's shadow traits, insecurities, projection, unhealed trauma, does not excuse their behavior but clarifies its origin. Understanding that their chaos is a reflection of their inner disarray rather than a judgment on her worth prevents internalization. The sovereign queen maintains empathy without surrendering authority. Her discernment transforms emotional turbulence into insight, turning potential vulnerability into a source of wisdom and autonomy. Ultimately, consistent application of boundary work, emotional clarity, energy sovereignty, and shadow integration consolidates self-reclamation. The sovereign queen moves through relational spaces with a commanding presence that is simultaneously calm and unassailable. Manipulative tactics lose efficacy because they meet a consciousness that is grounded, informed, and impervious to deception. Freedom is no longer an aspiration. It is the natural consequence of sustained awareness and disciplined practice. Ask yourself, which boundaries have you yet to embody fully? Where might you be yielding energy unnecessarily? And how would your life shift if clarity guided every choice? The sovereign queen understands that liberation is the sum of small, intentional acts, repeated consistently, until they form the architecture of an untouchable self. The moment of true emancipation arrives not with confrontation but with presence. The sovereign queen has observed, reflected, and acted with intention. She no longer measures her worth by the reactions of others, nor does she wait for validation to feel complete. Her boundaries are not defensive walls. They are the scaffolding of her inner authority. Every interaction becomes a choice rather than a response. When manipulation arises, it encounters a consciousness that neither trembles nor chases, and the old patterns of coercion crumble silently before her steadiness. Emotional clarity is her ally. She names the currents of feeling within, separating fear from intuition, guilt from responsibility, desire from obligation. The manipulator thrives in ambiguity, feeding on uncertainty and emotional noise. By maintaining clarity, the sovereign queen converts potential chaos into ordered awareness. She understands the subtle distinction between empathy and entanglement, offering compassion without surrendering autonomy. Each act of discernment chips away at the power dynamics that once held her captive. The empath-narcissist cycle, once a repeating trap of attachment and withdrawal, now collapses. Awareness exposes the scripts that were unconsciously enacted, the overextension of care, the internalization of blame, the misalignment of self and other. Through steady application of emotional intelligence and boundary work, the sovereign queen disrupts the rhythm that manipulators rely upon. Withdrawal, indifference, and measured engagement are tools she wields intentionally, dismantling patterns that previously seemed inevitable. What once demanded her energy now meets only calm, sovereign presence. Self-reclamation expands beyond the relational context into the inner world. She examines old attachment wounds with courage, asking, "Which fears are mine and which were imposed upon me?" Recognition of inherited trauma does not invite surrender, it provides instruction. Each insight is a seed of autonomy, each acknowledgement a step toward integration. The sovereign queen does not merely survive manipulation. She grows stronger in its aftermath, transforming exposure to emotional distortion into a curriculum of wisdom and empowerment. Energy management is now instinctual. Where she once gave indiscriminately, she now discerns with precision. Emotional labor is allocated intentionally and no longer wasted on control, guilt, or appeasement. Silence is deployed strategically, presence becomes magnetic, and neutrality functions as a shield. The manipulator, once able to pull strings through subtle provocation, now encounters a presence unyielding and grounded, in the void left by her detachment. Their influence collapses, proving that liberation begins within, independent of external outcomes. The sovereign queen also embraces the shadow within herself, recognizing moments of projection, insecurity, or over-identification allows her to act with conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. Shadow integration turns potential vulnerability into a wellspring of insight. Each reflection strengthens her internal architecture, ensuring that no manipulator can exploit unexamined fears or desires. This self-knowledge becomes both shield and compass, guiding her toward interactions that reinforce, rather than deplete, her sovereignty. Finally, the culmination of all practices, boundary work, emotional clarity, energetic sovereignty, and shadow integration, results in freedom that is both external and internal. Relationships are no longer arenas of control or subtle coercion. They are spaces of mutual respect and conscious engagement. The manipulator's hold dissolves naturally, not through conflict, but through the presence of a woman who embodies self-possession. She is a living example of feminine power that is calm, grounded, and irresistible in its autonomy. Pause and reflect. In which areas do you still unconsciously yield your energy? Where could clarity replace reaction and presence replace anxiety? The sovereign queen understands that liberation is cumulative, formed through repeated, intentional choices that anchor her in sovereignty. Every decision, no matter how small, contributes to an unshakable authority over self and space. At last, the sovereign queen reaches the apex of her journey. The patterns that once ensnared her, gaslighting, ego projection, emotional distortion, have lost their grip. She moves through the world with a quiet assurance, each choice emanating from inner authority rather than external expectation. Emotional clarity, previously a skill she cultivated cautiously, now flows naturally. Boundaries are not reactive fences but declarations of self-possession, visible in her posture, tone, and attention. In the presence of her sovereignty, manipulation cannot survive. It evaporates into irrelevance. She has reclaimed her energy fully. The trauma bonds that once held her in cycles of attachment have disintegrated, not through force, but through understanding and intentional withdrawal. Each connection she maintains is now reciprocal, conscious, and nourishing. She recognizes subtle attempts at control immediately, responding with composed detachment, and allowing only relationships that honor her integrity to remain. Her awareness transforms every interaction. What was once draining becomes an opportunity to exercise discernment and assertiveness. Self-reclamation extends beyond relationships into the depths of her own psyche. She acknowledges the shadows within: fear, doubt, and past conditioning, not as weaknesses but as teachers. Integration of these shadows transforms potential vulnerabilities into sources of wisdom and resilience. She understands the rhythm of her own mind and the triggers that once dictated reactive behavior. Through deliberate reflection, the sovereign queen no longer unconsciously enacts old patterns. She chooses responses aligned with her highest self. This is mastery, not domination, clarity without aggression. Energy, once dissipated in emotional labor and unbalanced attachment, is now harnessed intentionally. She offers presence without overextension, compassion without self-abandonment, and attention without surrendering autonomy. Silence becomes a tool of power, patience a strategy of influence. The manipulative tactics that previously disrupted her peace now meet only calm discernment, proving that freedom is both internal and external. Her life reflects the truth that sovereignty is the ultimate antidote to coercion. Her emotional intelligence serves as a compass. She reads intentions and dynamics with precision, distinguishing projection from truth, fear from instinct, and control from authentic influence. Each decision is guided by this inner compass, rooted in self-respect and awareness. The manipulator's influence, once amplified by ambiguity and uncertainty, now dissolves before her unwavering presence. She does not chase, she does not plead. She simply exists with clarity, and that alone redefines the power dynamic. Finally, relationships evolve into conscious, reciprocal experiences. Connection is no longer transactional, conditional, or coercive. It becomes a dance of mutual respect, choice, and authenticity. The sovereign queen does not sacrifice herself for approval, nor does she accept diminished value. Her presence alone communicates that authenticity is non-negotiable, and manipulation cannot coexist with self-possession. In this space, love, attention, and engagement flow naturally, freely, and intentionally. Pause for reflection. Which areas of your life still allow subtle control to persist? Where can boundaries be clarified? And where can presence replace anxiety? The sovereign queen knows that freedom is cumulative, strengthened by repeated acts of self-possession, emotional clarity, and discernment. Every moment she chooses herself over approval, she builds the architecture of autonomy that cannot be shaken by others, manipulations. The transformation is complete. She has mastered her inner world and reclaimed her outer authority. She walks through relationships, challenges, and opportunities with unwavering poise, immune to coercion, clear in her intention, and sovereign in every choice. This is the culmination of emotional intelligence applied, shadow integrated, boundaries respected, and self fully reclaimed. Her life becomes the proof that liberation begins within. Share the moment you finally said, "enough," and reclaimed your power in the comments below. The woman who sees the truth chooses her peace.